The studio was buzzing with its usual late-night energy when Mark Wahlberg strode onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, greeted by loud applause and flashing lights. He looked relaxed at first glance, dressed casually but sharp, offering that familiar half-smile as he waved to the crowd. Jimmy welcomed him with a grin, launching straight into light banter about Mark's famously intense workout routine, joking that he probably woke up at an hour most people didn't even know existed. Mark laughed, playing along, nodding as if he'd heard every version of the joke 100 times before. The audience chuckled, the band chimed in, and everything felt comfortably predictable. As the conversation continued, Jimmy leaned into Mark's career, praising his transformation from early controversies to blockbuster stardom. He framed it as admiration, but there was an edge beneath the compliments. Mark shifted slightly in his chair, crossing his arms for a moment before relaxing them again. He answered politely, talking about discipline, growth, and surrounding himself with the right people. His tone was calm, measured, almost rehearsed, as if he knew exactly how this segment was supposed to go. The crowd nodded along, sensing a motivational moment coming. Then Jimmy smirked and tossed out what sounded like just another joke. He suggested that Mark's no-nonsense tough guy image was less about authenticity and more about branding, saying something along the lines of how Hollywood loved a good redemption arc, especially when it came wrapped in muscle and catchphrases. The audience laughed instinctively, but the laughter wavered when Mark didn't join in. His smile lingered for half a second too long before fading. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly, as if replaying the words in his mind to make sure he'd heard them right. Mark tried to respond lightly, making a quick remark about how everyone in Hollywood had a brand, including late-night hosts. It earned a small laugh, but the tension was already creeping in. Jimmy, sensing an opening, pushed further. He mimicked Mark's intense stare, exaggerating it for comedic effect, and joked about how even his motivational speeches sounded like they could double as a locker room pep talk or a warning. This time, the audience's laughter was mixed with uncertain murmurs. The joke lingered too long, and the camera caught Mark's jaw tightening. For a brief moment, Mark looked out at the crowd instead of at Jimmy, inhaling slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone. He talked about how easy it was to reduce someone's life to a punchline, how people loved to joke about reinvention without understanding what it actually took. The room grew quieter. Jimmy tried to interrupt with a quick quip, but Mark continued, not raising his voice, just making his point with deliberate clarity. He spoke about mistakes, accountability, and the years of work it took to earn respect in an industry that never forgets. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap or stay silent. The band didn't play. The laughter sign was useless now. Mark's posture straightened as he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. He emphasized that jokes were fine, but there was a difference between humor and dismissal. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, and the casual, late-night rhythm completely dissolved. The cameras lingered on Jimmy's face as his grin faded into something more cautious. Jimmy attempted to soften the moment, raising his hands slightly and saying he was just messing around, but the damage was already done. Mark shook his head slowly, a small, frustrated smile flickering across his face. He clarified that he wasn't angry about jokes, but about the idea that growth could be trivialized for a laugh. The crowd was silent now, hanging on to every word. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had transformed into something deeply personal, almost confrontational, and no one in the room could quite predict where it was headed next. Jimmy cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, forcing a chuckle that echoed awkwardly through the studio. He tried to regain control, tossing out a line about how late-night shows were built on poking fun at everyone, including himself. Under normal circumstances, it would have landed. This time, it floated in the air and fell flat. Mark didn't sit back down. He remained standing, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other gesturing slowly as he spoke again. His tone wasn't explosive yet, but it carried a sharp intensity that made the room feel smaller. He said he understood comedy, that he'd done comedies himself and respected the craft, but there was a point where humor turned into something else entirely. He talked about carrying labels for decades, about how some mistakes followed you no matter how much work you put in to be better. The audience listened in stunned silence, the kind that only happens when people realize they're witnessing something unplanned. Mark's voice cracked just slightly as he mentioned his family, his kids, and how he wanted them to see a man who owned his past but wasn't defined by it forever. Jimmy tried again to interject, nodding and saying he respected that, but Mark raised a hand, not aggressively, just firmly. That small gesture alone sent a ripple through the crowd. He said he wasn't there to give a speech, but he wasn't going to sit quietly while his journey was turned into a cheap laugh. His words came faster now, the frustration finally bubbling closer to the surface. The polished late-night set, with its warm lighting and playful backdrop, felt completely out of sync with the raw emotion unfolding in front of it. A few audience members began to clap hesitantly, unsure if it was appropriate. The applause stopped almost as quickly as it started. Mark took a step away from the chair and paced once, running a hand over his face before turning back toward Jimmy. He said this was exactly why people struggled to be real in public, because the moment you opened up, someone would twist it for entertainment. His voice rose then, not into a shout, but into something louder, more forceful, impossible to ignore. Jimmy's expression shifted from awkward humor to visible concern. He glanced briefly toward the side of the stage, likely at producers signaling him through the chaos. He apologized, more sincerely this time, saying he hadn't meant to cross a line. For a second, it seemed like the tension might break. Mark stopped pacing and looked directly at him, breathing heavily. The room held its breath with him. But instead of sitting back down, Mark let out a short, bitter laugh. He said apologies after the fact didn't erase moments like this, especially when millions of people were watching. He spoke about how these clips would live online forever, stripped of context, turned into headlines and memes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Even as he spoke, the moment was becoming exactly what he was describing. The band remained silent. The cameras didn't cut away. Mark finally reached the peak of his frustration, his voice sharp and unmistakably angry as he said he was done playing along. He thanked the audience, not sarcastically, but with a strange mix of sincerity and finality. Without waiting for a response, he stepped away from the chair and started toward the edge of the stage. Jimmy stood up then, calling after him, asking him to wait, to sit back down so they could talk it out. Mark paused at the edge of the stage, turning back one last time. He said some things didn't need to be wrapped up neatly for television, that real conversations were messy and uncomfortable, and maybe that was something people needed to see more often. The crowd erupted into a confused mix of applause, gasps, and murmurs as he gave a brief nod and walked off. The moment he disappeared backstage, the studio felt hollow. Jimmy stood there for a few seconds, hands on his desk, visibly shaken. He eventually addressed the audience, acknowledging the intensity of what had just happened and promising they'd be back after the break. When the screen finally faded to commercial, viewers at home were left stunned, replaying the exchange in their minds. By the next morning, the clip dominated social media, sparking fierce debates about respect, comedy, and accountability. Some praised Mark for speaking his truth, others criticized him for losing his temper on live television. Jimmy released a statement expressing regret and respect for Mark's feelings. But no matter which side people took, one thing was undeniable: that night had delivered a rare, unscripted moment where celebrity polish gave way to raw emotion, and late-night television briefly stopped being a show and became something uncomfortably real.